So this is a video talking through some of the highlights from the discussion that I noticed around the Purdue Owl Writing Lab sample tutorial video. I have just some highlights to go over in terms of what people talked about, and then I'm going to be adding some of my 2 cents regarding some other thoughts that I had that people didn't necessarily cover. So in terms of some highlights of things that I noticed people were bringing up in the discussion about those two videos, a lot of people talked about the fact that the tutor could have taken time to establish more rapport, which I totally agree with. It seemed like he moved really quickly into the business at hand. And what I like to recommend based on the video that I made last week on best practices for tutorials is setting an agenda, some small talk, getting to know each other a little bit, just to make the tutee feel a little bit more comfortable and less intimidated or awkward with you. And then starting with the context also, he could have asked what the assignment was. You could go through the assignment together, take a look at some of the requirements. He didn't go through that step, and that's a really important part of a tutorial. He could also ask the tutee, what do you usually struggle with or do well when it comes to writing? Get a little bit of a history maybe before we jump right into the task at hand. The first video, a lot of people talked about how it was a bit too directive. The tutor did too much writing. He kind of took over, put the paper in front of him, and was like line editing her stuff basically while she was on her phone. A really good thing to notice. Yes, the tutor was taking over too much. He did well in terms of sitting next to her, which people talked about. He set boundaries really well, which a couple people picked up on. The first video, he seemed to stick to them, or the second one, he seemed to really stick to those boundaries. The first one, he didn't, right? So he was like, we don't edit here, blah, 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 and then he started editing her paper. He did stay calm and collected. He could have looked for patterns of error more, somebody picked up on, which I would agree with. You know, if you're noticing a pattern in the error that the student is making or that tutee is making, make sure that you point that out to them so they can avoid that in the future. A couple people talked about how he said, I heard you slow down in certain points of the paper as she was reading. And that's a good opportunity for you to prompt the client to noticing something sounds weird, right? So why did you slow down there? What exactly made you slow down? That's a really good point to kind of let them know that something's going on, right? A bunch of people also mentioned the fact that he didn't talk badly about other tutors, even though he knew that maybe a past session, the client had come in and they had done maybe a little bit too much proofreading for them and was a little bit too directive. He still didn't really talk badly about another tutor. He was just like, well, that shouldn't have happened, and then moved on to giving the boundaries, basically. I really liked that someone picked up on the fact that he used collaborative terms like we and us instead of, you know, just talking about the client. He used words that were very collaborative. He also stood by time constraints people talked about, and he didn't promise that they could get through the whole paper. That's really good to do just so your client knows what the limitations are. And then a lot of people liked that he had the client take notes for themselves instead of having the tutor take the notes. The tutor is also having the client take notes. So they have something to take with them when they leave, as well as that little debriefing session that you do at the end of a tutorial. And then a lot of people liked that he then reiterated that now that she has been reading out loud and picking up on errors herself, she can now go forward and try doing that on her own outside of the Writing Center. So those were some of the highlights that I noticed happening in the discussion. They were really great points. I agree with all of them. So a couple of things that occurred to me as I was reading the discussion and rewatching those videos was what to do if your client just won't have it and refuses to find mistakes on their own, or maybe can't find the errors on their own. So maybe they're reading out loud and they're not picking up on those places. They're not slowing down. Again, this is something you might notice with non-native English speakers in particular. That can happen. So in case that does happen, in case they're not picking up on those things themselves, it's okay for you to point out some places that are maybe including some errors, right? So take a look at this sentence. You're not using enough commas. Here's why. And then maybe point out another section where that's also happening. And then once they get the gist for what's going on, you can have them point it out themselves, right? So in that case, you're doing a little bit of the work for them just so they can see what's going on. And then after that, you're having them take a look at another section and pointing out the error themselves, right? So that's kind of like a combo of showing them, but also having them participate in the process of revising their paper. So that's something you can do. It's not ideal, but sometimes they don't pick up on stuff and you have to kind of help them and hold their hand a little bit more, and that's okay. Let's see. I would also say in terms of reading out loud, the tutor was successful in that second video, getting the client to read their paper out loud. Sometimes people will just flat out refuse to read their stuff out loud, either because they feel awkward, they're kind of shy, maybe they're insecure about how they would sound. That's okay when that happens. You can read it out loud instead. The most important point is that someone is reading it out loud, so you can go through it together as a team, okay? As long as you're not sitting there and reading the paper quietly to yourself, that's what I care about, okay? It does work the best if they are the ones reading it out loud, so try to encourage them as much as you can that that's something that we do here. But if they're really pushing back, it's okay for you to be doing the reading out loud, okay? Because at least then they're hearing it, at least you're going through it together at the same time. And then one more thing, you will get clients that bring in papers like the day before it's due, sometimes the morning when it's due that night, which is not ideal, as we know, because writing is a process, but it will happen, okay? Something to think about is, what do we do when we have a situation that feels this urgent, right? You still have to make sure that you're sticking to the time constraints. You still have to make sure that you're going through all of the steps that a good tutorial requires. So even if your client is kind of pushing you to go faster, it's really important that we're sticking to the procedure, because if we're cutting corners, if we're doing things too quickly, just because a client is being pushy, that means that we can do it more and more in the future. So just make sure that even though they're kind of pushing you, make sure that you stick to the procedure, because it's really important for us to be able to, go through that kind of process. Yeah, and then one more thing, actually, in one of the tutorials, the client was on their phone. Just make sure that if a client is on the phone in a session, that you're very nicely asking them to put it aside or put it in their bag, right? Because again, we want them to be active participants. So do the best you can with that situation. Okay, I think that's it.